doing a wide-ranging OC search. A lot of veteran names. Nathaniel Hackett's interviewing now with the Jets. History shows that taking a year off makes a lot of sense and does a lot of help.
The New York Jets are about to make a horrific mistake.
Or are they? This is a topic that, in my opinion, for a lot of people that was just glancing over Twitter, at the very minimum, I thought this was low-hanging fruit, which is why I made sure to bring you guys a video dissecting each and every side as to why this doesn't make sense, while this does also make sense for the New York Jets. So before we get to the content, man, make sure you drop a like, subscribe, and turn on our notifications to help the channel grow. If you want to go the extra mile to support the content, there's a Patreon and a channel memberships program. Now that we get all that out of the way, break! You know what absolutely crushes my soul? Whenever I carefully and meticulously make multiple picks, and let's say 3 out of my 4 players hit, and my 4th player unfortunately didn't even play in the second half of the game or left the game early, and as a result, I lose my money.
That wasn't very nice.
Which is why PrizePicks is now protecting all of us from that happening ever again. Introducing Reboot. If you happen to ever pick more on a player's projection, and that player leaves the game in the first half, and he doesn't return in the second half, then PrizePicks will automatically disqualify that player. So let's say I chose 3 players and picked more on all of them, and one of those players has to leave the game, unfortunately due to an injury, and doesn't return in the second half. Then my 3 picks will automatically turn into 2 picks. I play PrizePicks every single day, and I post my picks onto my Instagram story. And right now, PrizePicks is willing to match up to $100 of your deposit when you use my promo code Mikerophone. So use my promo code right now and let's win some money together. And thank you, PrizePicks, for the sponsor. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? Nathaniel Hackett was by far the biggest meme in the entire NFL this past year. A head coach that was expected to, at the very minimum, lure over Aaron Rodgers from the Green Bay Packers because Aaron Rodgers said stuff like this about him.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's the number one thing. There's nobody in the building that brings me more joy or is more fun to be around than Nathaniel Hackett. I just knew Hack and I were gonna bond, but he's become, such a close confidant and friend, besides a fantastic coach. And I just really can't express enough how important he is to our team in so many ways. He's incredible in front of a room. He brings a lot of great energy that's really important to not just meetings that can sometimes, without the energy he infuses, maybe get long at times. Never feels that way with him in front of the room. But Hack has really embraced the idea of celebration together as well, which I think is such a vital part of us coming together and being a close-knit group. I think he's got a great mind. Hack has been a really important part of our culture change and a part of our success on offense. I love him. Hope he doesn't go anywhere. Unless I do.
Who inevitably wasn't able to get Aaron Rodgers to come over because, well, Aaron Rodgers just decided to stay with the Packers, which was a shock to a lot of us, myself included. He ended up having to settle for Russell Wilson, who, with respect to Russell Wilson, is a pretty damn good quarterback when he's not wearing a Denver Broncos uniform. Unfortunately for Nathaniel Hackett, everything went wrong this past year. From the fact that Russell Wilson was missing key reads, to watching KJ Hamler melt down whenever Russell Wilson missed a read to him, to even his debut when it was 4th and 5, he completely mismanaged a situation with the Denver Broncos in Russell Wilson's debut versus the Seattle Seahawks. This became a storyline throughout the year, and through it all, Russell Wilson tried to be as professional as possible, while you saw multiple instances where Denver Broncos players were trying to kill each other, like quite literally. They were yelling at one another constantly. This is something we saw over and over again. As a result, since Russell Wilson signed the 2nd highest contract in the entire NFL this past offseason before even playing it down with the Denver Broncos.
Brilliant work by the Broncos GM there.
The Broncos didn't really have any choice but to try to make it work with Russell Wilson. So, since it didn't work out with Nathaniel Hackett, they decided to fire him. Now, in defense of Nathaniel Hackett, I've done a lot more digging on him recently. Nathaniel Hackett wasn't given the tools he needed to succeed. A lot of people expected Nathaniel Hackett to come in and make Russell Wilson into some sort of passing savant. And to be honest, he had the tools to do it. Portland Cortland Sutton is a phenomenal wide receiver. KJ Hamler is a fantastic slot wide receiver. Jerry Jeudy was selected in the first round of a loaded NFL draft for a reason, and he was considered to be the most pro-ready prospect out of all of them. Although so far he hasn't lived up to his potential, the tools were there for a dominant passing attack. Unfortunately, that's not what ended up happening. And through it all, and I blame myself for this, there's one thing a lot of people forgot. That's the fact that Nathaniel Hackett was never a passing guru. He has a very strange history. Now, you might be wondering where the New York Jets fall into this. We'll get to that in just a sec. To give you a history lesson on Nathaniel Hackett, in 2013, the Buffalo Bills hired Doug Marrone as their head coach, and Nathaniel Hackett was brought in to be the offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills then. He was working with quarterbacks like E.J. Manuel and Thaddeus Lewis and Jeff Toole. You guys remember those guys? The Bills were ranked 29th in passing offense that year, but they had some pretty good running backs. If you remember, they had C.J. Spiller and Fred Jackson. By the time Kyle Orton took over as the quarterback for the Bills, things started to improve a little bit. Now, Doug Marrone left the Buffalo Bills and ended up with the Jacksonville Jaguars, and just like that, he also took Nathaniel Hackett with him. This time, he wasn't the offensive coordinator. Rather, in 2015 and 2016, he was the quarterback's coach. Do you know what quarterback he was coaching? Blake Bortles. To be honest, Blake Bortles' development speaks for itself. A lot of people love to call quarterbacks like Blake Bortles bona fide busts. I like to think of them as players whose coaches failed them, because at the end of the day, Blake Bortles came out of college as something we all knew, a project QB. He had a lot to work on if he wanted to become successful. Very similar to Josh Allen, only Josh Allen made a crazy jump to become one of the dominant quarterbacks in the NFL, whereas Blake Bortles wasn't able to develop. Now, whether that's Nathaniel Hackett's fault or not is a different story. But what Nathaniel Hackett did do, which is very reminiscent of what he did in Buffalo, is although Blake Bortles didn't really look like a good quarterback, in 2017, during that lone year that the Jacksonville Jaguars came very close to making a Super Bowl appearance, Nathaniel Hackett was the offensive coordinator of the top rushing offense in the NFL, Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, the Jaguars wouldn't have the same success next year, and Nathaniel Hackett would be out of a job because of that, because Doug Marrone would also be out of a job. Hackett would then get another opportunity in 2019 when he was the offensive coordinator of the Green Bay Packers. He would stay with the Packers until the Denver Broncos hired him away, probably to lure over Aaron Rodgers. So what did you learn from all this? Nathaniel Hackett was never a good passing game coordinator. He was never a good quarterback coach. He had a couple seasons where he showed promise as a fairly good running game coordinator. So you might be wondering why I'm bringing all this up. Well, the New York Jets are in a very funky situation. After failing to tank properly for the best player in the 2021 NFL Draft, Trevor Lawrence, the New York Jets decided to take Zach Wilson with the number 2 overall pick, who was drawing comparisons to Patrick Mahomes because of a phenomenal performance at his throwing day. All right, to be honest, it was this one throw that resembled Patrick Mahomes. This one throw is the reason why I have trust issues with the NFL Combine and with pro days. The Jets clearly have a really good defense. Their quarterback is a project that's struggling, and in my opinion, they do have the potential to at least be a wild card team in their division. Does this sound familiar to you at all? Sounds a lot like the Jacksonville Jaguars. I mean, you could draw parallels here. Sauce Gardner is Jalen Ramsey. Calais Campbell and Marcel Darius is Quinnen Williams and Carl Lawson. All right, not exactly, but you guys get where I'm going with this. And most importantly, Zach Wilson is Blake Bortles. Now, obviously, no situation's the same, but they're very similar circumstances. So with that being said, the New York Jets decided to meet with former Broncos head coach, Packers offensive coordinator Nathaniel Hackett about their offensive coordinator position. This is coming to us originally from Diana Rossini. Hackett was fired by Denver earlier this season after going 4-11 in 15 games. The immediate reaction is fairly obvious. You look at Russell Wilson for the 2 games that he didn't have Nathaniel Hackett, he had a 63% completion percentage and 6 total touchdowns. People are saying that Nathaniel Hackett held Russell Wilson back, and it does make sense considering the fact that Javonte Williams was out the entire season and Melvin Gordon, I guess you could say, looked like a shell of his former self or just had a lot of fumbling issues. You also had Tim Patrick that was out all season. Whatever excuse you want to make, it's there. Now, I'm not here to tell you that Nathaniel Hackett is the right man for the job. I'm giving you this info to explain what the New York Jets are thinking. They didn't lose their minds all of a sudden. I'm a firm believer that just because a man is a bad head coach doesn't necessarily mean he's a bad coordinator. In the case of Nathaniel Hackett, I'm not necessarily sure. He's shown enough potential to at least warrant a look because maybe there's something there in the running game. And Nathaniel Hackett clearly has a tremendous enthusiasm for the game of football, but it does seem very strange to hire your offensive coordinator, Mike LaFleur, conceivably because he failed to develop Zach Wilson, and he is on record citing his failures with Zach Wilson. I mean, he went in depth. Take a look at this.
Good job. I got to do a better job for him. I got to do a better job for the offense. I truly believe it starts with me, it ends with me. So I got to figure out a way to reset him, get him back to playing fundamentally sound football, and more importantly, just consistent football, because he's done some really good things, but I haven't done a good enough job to get the consistency out of him. So that starts and ends with me.
I mean, he really went in and really blamed himself for his inability to develop Zach Wilson as a quarterback. Now, here's where things get interesting, because I've shown you the Mike LaFleur clip before, but now, according to this article from Zach Rosenblatt of The Athletic, there's a lot more context about what went on and why Mike LaFleur said what he said in this interview. And it gives you a nice little deep inside look as to what happened with the New York Jets this past season. And it gets really juicy here. In week 3, the Jets lost to the Bengals on a bad day when they turned the ball over 4 times. They were 1-2 with Joe Flacco starting at quarterback in place of the injured Zach Wilson. And fans were readying their pitchforks. Saleh thought of that tweet again. He texted it to some people he thought needed to see it. "We'll be fine," Saleh said to anyone that was willing to listen. "We have the pieces." Once Zach Wilson returned in week 4, the Jets won 5 of their next 6 games. Powered by an elite defense, an effective ground game, and a trio of rookies. Cornerback Sauce Gardner, wide receiver Garrett Wilson, and running back Breece Hall were quickly emerging as stars. But while this was going on, Robert Saleh was working behind the scenes to put out fires and ease tensions in a locker room growing increasingly frustrated with the lack of production from Wilson, the 23-year-old quarterback who was the number 2 pick of the 2021 NFL Draft. I remember really well, earlier this year, I made a video on Elijah Moore and Denzel Mims demanding a trade. I mentioned the fact that they may be frustrated because Zach Wilson wasn't really producing as a quarterback. At the time, I got flamed because the Jets won 5 out of their 6 games. As a matter of fact, if you go look at the comment section of that video, the comments are still there. Although I did do a little victory lap. Now this is where it gets interesting. The Jets entered their bye week 6-3 with Saleh building internal support for his ability to weather the winds of controversy that enveloped many Jets coaches before him. He had players believing that they could overcome anything: trade requests, bad quarterback play, and injuries to key players. New York went into its bye week with a 60% chance of making the playoffs, but Saleh's message remained consistent: we still have a long way to go. You might be wondering, where does Mike LaFleur come in all this? Just wait, you'll see. There's a lot of scapegoating that goes down with this, and I'm sure you could already forecast what's going to happen. But before we dive into that, after reading this, you have to give Robert Saleh a lot of credit. I mean, just think of everything he was dealing with. He had players upset at the offensive coordinator, as you guys are about to see. He had trade requests from Denzel Mims and Elijah Moore that he took care of. He had a underperforming number 2 overall pick at the quarterback position, a constant revolving door at the QB position, and through it all, he stayed professional and even gave the New York Jets an opportunity to potentially make it into the playoffs. That's very difficult as a head coach. So you have to admit, I think Robert Saleh is definitely suited for this job. And in my opinion, he's been crushing it, given all the obstacles he's had to deal with. The article then begins to talk about Zach Wilson's horrible performance against the New England Patriots and how this was a little bit too much for Saleh to overcome. He had been putting out fires all season, but he couldn't ignite a broken offense. The Jets finished 7-10, losing 7 of their final 8 games and 6 in a row to end the season. And I think this is the most important part of this article. Compromised by injuries to key players, the offense couldn't overcome a quarterback, Zach Wilson, who lost his confidence, and a coordinator, Mike LaFleur, who felt constrained by the quarterback's limitations. Wide receivers openly expressed frustration with the direction of the offense. Defensive players collectively shrugged, wondering how much more they could have done. And this kind of gives you an idea of why Mike LaFleur is no longer the offensive coordinator of the New York Jets. In November, Mike LaFleur was pegged as a future head coach, and in January, he was let go in a mutual parting of ways. The article continues saying, Saleh has said that the quarterback is the head of the snake, and that you want the head of the snake to be stable. Jets will spend the offseason looking for a new quarterback since Wilson, most have accepted, is not the solution. I said it earlier in the video, man, and I'll say it all offseason long. I don't necessarily think that the Jets are going to give up on Zach Wilson so quickly, mainly because they still have like 3 more years to evaluate whether he could be their franchise QB. Zach Wilson's really freaking young, man. I mean, he's currently currently 23 years old, and I think he still has the opportunity to develop into a good quarterback. It's just he needs to fix his mechanics issues. But this is about Mike LaFleur here. It goes into Mike LaFleur and Robert Saleh's history with one another, saying that both of them have been fellow assistants on the 49ers under Kyle Shanahan. Saleh was the defensive coordinator, LaFleur was the passing game coordinator, and they'd known each other for years. Saleh worked and lived with Mike's brother Matt at Central Michigan and would annoy a teenaged Mike by hogging the TV when he visited the LaFleur family home in Mount Pleasant, Michigan. LaFleur's hiring was praised by many around the league. It's the West Coast system. He said in his introductory news conference, "We're trying to run the outside zone and do the play action stuff off of it, but we fit it to our players. Some players found the system to be needlessly complicated." If you guys want to get an idea, pretty much what Mike LaFleur was trying to do was he was trying to create a simple offense, kind of similar to what Kyle Shanahan had in San Francisco for Jimmy Garoppolo. And this system's worked really well. I mean, Mike McDaniel's employing it perfectly with Tua right now. This article also mentions how complicated it was, and to give you an idea, there would be one route, but it would have a bunch of different names depending on the concept. That a former Jets receiver who spent time with the team in training camp this year, I've been on multiple teams. This is the first time I've ever experienced that. So for the most part, it was needlessly complex. It seems like they're blaming this for the downfall of Zach Wilson, because it continues to say that Zach Wilson struggled with the complexity of the scheme and went 3-10 as the starter. Over the offseason, LaFleur and QB coach Rob Calabrese studied what worked for Wilson in 2021 and what didn't. There was some level of frustration. LaFleur would tell people how much more effective the offense looked with quarterbacks Flacco, Josh Johnson, and especially Mike White, and the stats backed it up. Oh man, this is really juicy. I mean, it seems like we're getting an inside look behind the scenes as to what happened, and this all seems very plausible because it's mentioning things that are without a doubt the truth. I mean, Mike White and Joe Flacco and Josh Johnson were more effective as quarterbacks of the New York Jets this year than Zach Wilson, but the conundrum is Zach Wilson was the New York Jets' future. So Mike LaFleur adjusted the scheme. He reduced the volume of plays and tried to make things more digestible. Wilson seemed to have a better handle on the offense in OTAs and went into the rest of the offseason committed to building chemistry with his wide receivers. I think this part's really important because everyone looks at Zach Wilson as some like snobby, spoiled punk out of Utah, but it seems like he really put in work to try to establish a relationship with his teammates. Says he spent thousands of dollars flying to Florida, Arizona, and Tennessee to work out with teammates. Wilson invited most of the team's skilled position players and quarterbacks to Idaho for a getaway right before training camp, a fun weekend relaxing in the company of celebrities like Wayne Gretzky and Justin Bieber. Some of Wilson's teammates appreciated the effort he was putting in. One receiver even said that I never hung out with him outside the building or anything, but from my experience, he was a cool, down-to-earth dude. There was even an instance of a New York Jets receiver by the name of Calvin Jackson signing with the New York Jets, with Zach Wilson telling him, "I'm happy you're here." And when Jackson was cut, Wilson called to make sure that he was okay and in the right headspace. To give you an idea of how bad things got for Zach Wilson throughout the season, Zach Wilson would make his debut in Week 4 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. He would struggle for 3 quarters, and though he did catch a second quarter touchdown on a trick play, you know, that famous play where he did a gritty in the end zone after scoring a touchdown in his return, in the 4th quarter with the Jets trailing by 10, Zach Wilson pulled his teammates aside and told them in so many words to man up. He completed 10 of 12 passes for 128 yards and a touchdown that quarter while playing through an ankle injury, and the Jets won 24-20. Robert Saleh said after the game that the young man doesn't flinch, but things got worse from there. According to this article, Mike LaFleur told Zach Wilson when he returned to game action to look at his first read, then look at his second read, and if they're not there, then run. And this worked to perfection against the Pittsburgh Steelers and against the Miami Dolphins. In Week 6, the Jets won in Green Bay, even though Zach Wilson didn't really perform well, 10 of 18 passes for 110 yards, while playing through a shoulder injury, by the way. But this wasn't sustainable, and the skill position players were getting upset. For example, Garrett Wilson had 1 reception against the Packers. Elijah Moore wasn't targeted at all while running 14 routes. Moore reportedly first expressed his displeasure to teammates after the Packers game, questioning his future with the Jets. That night, he also responded to a tweet about his lack of targets, saying, "If I say what I really want to say, I'll be the selfish guy. Just know I don't understand either." This frustration would spill into practice. That Thursday, Elijah Moore surprised teammates and coaches by blowing up on Mike LaFleur, telling him to go himself and you suck. You would get sent home, then demand a trade, would make him the second wide receiver that demanded a trade that year because Denzel Mims also demanded a trade and he was buried on the depth chart and he was also a second round pick. Now the Jets decided not to trade either of them and Elijah Moore and Mike LaFleur would end up hugging it out, but it's really interesting to see how deep this went. And it also kind of makes sense why the Jets would be looking at a much more simplistic offense following what happened this past year. And that's fine because if there's one coordinator in this league that is going to have more opportunities at a coordinator position than one of the Ryan brothers, it's going to be Mike LaFleur. I mean, his brother is the head coach of the Green Bay Packers and they've had a lot of success. He has ties to Sean McVay, whose entire coaching staff is literally a head coaching factory. I mean, it's crazy how many head coaching positions came from the Sean McVay coaching tree already. I mean, Kevin O'Connell, the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, Matt LaFleur, the head coach of the Green Bay Packers, Kyle Shanahan, the head coach of the San Francisco 49ers. Sean McVay is just pumping out head coaches left and right. I think that's a huge reason he's staying in the NFL this season, by the way, just so he can help his buddies out because he seems like a cool guy. And currently, Mike LaFleur is rumored to join his head coaching staff next, so I think he's going to be okay. My issue here is you clearly fired Mike LaFleur for his inability to develop Zach Wilson properly, which is fine. That makes a lot of sense because you drafted Zach Wilson with the number 2 overall pick, and you have until 2026 to make something out of him, or 2025 to make something out of him. And I'm all on board with the idea of bringing in a veteran quarterback and having Zach Wilson sit on the bench for a season and just working on his mechanics, because I think that could save his career. I think Zach Wilson does possess tremendous arm talent, but until he refines his mechanics the way Josh Allen did, which is a huge thing to ask from someone, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel if Zach Wilson wants to choose it. In order to do that, I don't necessarily think you have the ability to develop in that manner in just one off season. So I understand the idea of bringing in, say, a veteran quarterback like Derek Carr, who had 900 of his pass yards coming from play action this past year and attempted the most play action pass attempts of his career over this past year as well. I think it makes a lot of sense to have Derek Carr as your bridge QB because this team is good enough to compete now. I don't necessarily think you need a superstar at the quarterback position to compete currently either. I think you could get by with a player like Jimmy Garoppolo as well, who also could serve as a mentor to Zach Wilson. I mean, Jimmy G was placed in this situation already over the past 2 years when the 49ers drafted Trey Lance, and he handled that situation with class and grace. You don't want a Ryan Tannehill, Malik Willis-like situation here. You want a man that could clearly get this team where they need to go, and you want Zach Wilson watching him. So with that being said, where does Nathaniel Hackett fit into all of this? Nathaniel Hackett would try to do with the New York Jets what he did with the Jacksonville Jaguars in 2017. People tend to forget, but the New York Jets had a very formidable rushing attack with the likes of Breece Hall and Michael Carter before. Now they have Breece Hall, Michael Carter, and James Robinson. I think that's enough for Hackett to work with. You supplement that with a really good defense and a quarterback that'll make you pay in play action, which is either Jimmy Garoppolo or Derek Carr, and you have Zach Wilson watching all this and working on his own development. Hopefully he could scratch that potential where he's the next coming of Patrick Mahomes. Again, I don't like calling players the next coming of anything, but at the very minimum, you're developing the man you spent the number 2 overall pick on while still chasing your potential window for contention, which the Jets have. Do I think Nathaniel Hackett is the right man for the job? To be honest, no, I really don't. I'm just here explaining to you the rationale here. I'm explaining to you why the Jets are conducting this interview, because every single person so far is just laughing at the Jets for potentially making a bad hire. It wouldn't be my top pick for a hire. It would be an individual that at the very minimum I could see why they would interview. I think there's way better offensive coordinator candidates there. I honestly think the dream scenario might be if Frank Reich can't find a head coaching job and he wants to be a coordinator. I think that's an ideal place for him. But I honestly think Frank Reich will probably end up with the Arizona Cardinals. So let me know in the comment section down below, what do you guys think about all this? Do you think the New York Jets are about to make it way worse for themselves, or do you guys actually see why Nathaniel Hackett could potentially make some sense? I'm not saying Nathaniel Hackett is the guy that they should hire. I'm just explaining the rationale and the reasoning here. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike. I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.